Let me ask you this. What kind of prerequisites do you have for doing what you most want to do? Have you recognized that you have all of these things that you think that you need to do and all of these things that need to be in place before you do something? More often than not, this tendency to kind of be addicted to prerequisites is a form of procrastination. And procrastination is a form of perfectionism. Oftentimes, the more importance that you put on getting something done, the more prerequisites will you subconsciously come up with to prevent you from actually doing the thing. It's very ironic and it's a paradox, but then again, a lot of things in reality is a paradox, right? So you subconsciously add on a lot of things that you feel like you should do and have to do before you actually do the thing. So what you will say to get around this and to not appear as if though you're procrastinating and to kind of like fool yourself is that you're planning. You're planning for this and you're planning for that. You're preparing yourself. You see? This kind of procrastination can often be disguised as preparation or planning. So let's say that you, for instance, want to start a podcast, all right? Just as an example. The more you wait with starting it, the more things you will come up with that you have to do and that has to be in place in order to start the podcast and truly go for it. So before you know it, you have this huge list of prerequisites that you have to do and that has to be in place before you actually do it. So you might say, I need to come up with a title for the podcast, get a cover artist to make the cover for the podcast, find some really fancy music for the podcast, make an intro for the podcast, make an outro for the podcast, plan out every single podcast in detail, write scripts for each podcast, come up with really fancy titles for the podcast, make a cover for each podcast episode, post so and so and so many times a week at this and this and this time, and it has to be like that. Find guests for the podcast, get the top kind of equipment for the podcast, set up a studio for the podcast. It has to be utterly quiet to record a podcast. I have to wear so and so and so to be recording a podcast if I'm on video. I need to take a course in creating a podcast. I need to read books about podcast creation. I need this and this and this and this, and so on and so forth. You go. You get the picture, right? So do you see here how you just add on all of these things that you believe that you should do and have to do in order for you to start? Of course, this can be really, really overwhelming. I just get super overwhelmed just by speaking it out loud, right? Putting it to paper, right? I get overwhelmed just by kind of the mere fact of imagining this list, right? It creates an enormous amount of resistance. And actually, it can totally put you off from doing it in the first place. So what initially may have started as a sense of curiosity and inspiration and motivation, it turned out to be something totally different. Suddenly, you're there, overwhelmed and frustrated that you haven't got all these things in place, and you feel like you should do all of them and that everything should be a certain way, but then it's not, right? So again, you have all of these prerequisites that must and should be in place before you actually start anything. If you instead decide to ask yourself, what would lower the amount of resistance here and increase the amount of flow in my podcast creation process? What would make the podcast creation fun and more efficient? How can I make the podcast production as simple as freaking possible? Suddenly, you start thinking differently. You start looking for opportunities to bring it down to the essentials. You take it off the pedestal and you bring it down to here and now. You start thinking, what is the main thing here? What is the purpose behind what I'm doing here? What is the main thing? You start to literally bring it down to the basics, and you begin working and creating from there, right? You allow yourself to play and learn in the process of doing it. And suddenly everything becomes way more fun because you are focusing on the intention behind what you're doing rather than having everything in place. The prerequisites kind of dissipates in a way when you kind of bloom beyond perfectionism, when you bloom beyond this kind of procrastination that is disguised as planning and preparing. For me, for example, these are the principles that I created this podcast from. I don't have a fancy cover, all right? I have the same for, the podcast and the episodes. I don't have an intro and outro. I don't have, background music. I don't have fancy titles. I have a word or a short sentence that I speak from. I never plan out more than bullet points for each and every podcast. If I even do that, I batch record podcasts back to back instead of spreading it out across a week or so. I record video and audio at the same time with a recording software that allows me to, actually simplify things as far as production is concerned. I edit podcasts back to back, right? I outsource all the things that I don't really need to do so that I can focus on the main thing, which is to spread the message about perfectionism and being able to help more high performers out there create a life and business of freedom from perfectionism with the power of the subconscious mind. So everything that I do in relation to this kind of comes down to that intention, yeah? And so it's very simple. It's very, very, very simple for me. So instead of adding lots of prerequisites, I subtract the things that I might think that I should do and have to do, and I bring it down to the basics, to the main thing. And the funny thing is that once you actually get started with a thing, you see that, I actually didn't need those prerequisites in the first place, right? More often than not, if you actually follow through on making sure that all of these prerequisites are fulfilled, and you actually do all of these things that you had on the list, you end up seeing that, oh shit, I actually did not need even half of this to be in place. And a lot of these things that I added to the list actually just creates a lot of frustration because I need to keep up with these things. Let's say that you're going to have, a lot of changes in regards to you're going to create this cover for each and every episode. Well, that is another thing on the list to do every single time you're creating a podcast, right? Same with the music. You need to find all this music for every single podcast. Obviously, if that is a calling for you, if that's a way to express yourself, and that is so important for the thing that you're doing, sure, go for it. But is it the main thing? For me, it's simply not. Even though that I'm creative, I love music, I can listen to music and I can record music and I can do all these things with music in different ways. I don't have to do it in this context. So it really depends on you. What is the main thing for you? And this is just one example with regards to, prerequisites and talking about podcasts. But, you may have prerequisites for a lot of other things too. It could be prerequisites for dating, for getting into a relationship, prerequisites for expressing yourself, taking risks, prerequisites for doing certain things that you've set your mind to, but you're not doing because you have all these prerequisites in place. So truly ask yourself, what is it that I really want to do, but that I'm not doing because I have prerequisites? And what are those prerequisites? Really just list them down, the things that you believe that you should do and have to do before you do it. And you will see that there are a lot of things that you actually don't need, okay? You can bring it down to the basics. So I invite you to do that. If you'd like to, know more on how to actually overcome having all these prerequisites in your life and business, then I can surely support you with that. Just apply to join the other sunflowers and bloomers by going to bloombeyond.com/apply. And once you apply, it's a 256 members limit, and we have monthly cohorts, okay? So there's a waiting time involved, and not everyone gets selected, but those that truly show commitment to overcome perfectionism and truly be able to step into the bright, brave, and balanced version of themselves, those are definitely invited at some point. So now you know more about prerequisites and how they actually truly can hinder you in creativity, in expressing yourself, and even developing connection, right, with yourself and others. There's not much that you need. There's not much that you have to do, right? Choose intentionally. What is the main thing? What is the main thing? What is the main thing? Until next time, stay bright, brave, and balanced.